Good morning, everyone. My name is Holly Dagris, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow with the Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council. Today, we have an important and very timely panel on the legal and policy paths for Iran's hostages, both foreign and dual nationals. It's an absolute honor that I host this event. Olivier Van de Castile, Machia Walczak. You may have missed the names of this Norwegian aid worker and Polish academic while following the news this last week. They are just two individuals of a long-growing list of foreign and dual nationals currently imprisoned by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Today is about them, but it's also about Siamak and Baghir Namazi, Morad Tabaz, Imad Sharqi, Benjamin Brier, Fariba Adelkha, Nahi Taghavi, and the countless others whom the Islamic Republic has unjustly detained. Hostage-taking has been a tool of choice for the Islamic Republic over the past 4 decades since the 444-day Iran hostage crisis, in which 52 Americans were taken hostage at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran between 1979 and 1981. According to the Center for Human Rights in Iran, there are at least 15 dual nationals, 6 foreign nationals, and 1 foreign permanent resident known to be jailed in Iran. These cases are ones that were made public. In 2017, Reuters reported that Iran was holding 30 dual nationals, some of whose identities are unknown. The arrests by the IRGC intelligence arm or intelligence ministry follow a familiar pattern. Iranian hostages undergo psychological and physical torture, are kept in poor prison conditions, denied legal counsel, consular access, and even visits by humanitarian organizations and the United Nations. Typically, hostages are handed long prison sentences based on alleged charges of espionage or threats to national security. These trumped-up charges tend to be unspecified or vague. Often, hostages are even asked to spy in exchange for their freedom. As lawyers today representing some of the current victims will tell you, hostage-taking by the Islamic Republic is used as economic or political bargaining chips by the Islamic Republic in their dealings with the West. State-sponsored hostage-taking is a crime under international law, and while it's not unique to the Islamic Republic, it's imperative to highlight given its regularity. Today's 2-part panel will discuss prevention and accountability strategies for state-sponsored hostage-taking. Over the years, I've closely followed and even written on the plight of some of the current and formerly detained on this panel for my newsletter. While living in London, I've visited Richard Radcliffe outside the Iranian embassy and later the Foreign Office while he was on hunger strike to free his wife, Nazanin Zaghari Radcliffe. And just recently, through a friend, I was able to connect with Nazar Zaka in Washington. And with that, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, Ambassador Roger Carstens.
Holly, thanks a lot for that kind introduction. Thanks for inviting me to this wonderful event. And I would like to, of course, thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this event today. It's an important one. You might imagine that it's important to me because this is my full-time job. But I think it's also important to this country and to humanity writ large. So again, thanks for everything you've done to bring us all together. So this is a hybrid event. That means that it's not only going to be in person, but it's also taking place online. So if everyone doesn't mind, I'm going to issue hybrid marks today. I have a wonderfully prepared speech, which I, of course, have marked up. But I'm also going to talk from the heart today because it's my belief that when you come to this problem, you've got to bring your heart. You've got to bring every fiber of your body or people are not going to trust you. They have to sense that you're genuine, that you care, and you're going to give it your all. So if everyone will forgive me as at times I go off script, I'm hoping to leave you with some sort of coherent picture of how the U.S. government views and is trying to address this challenge. But I at least wanted to start there by saying that this will probably be a little more unscripted than you might otherwise be used to. You know, when I look around the audience here, and I look specifically to these people up on the stage, I feel like I'm surrounded by friends. Jason and I, we've spent hours on the phone, usually when I'm coming home at like 8 or 9 at night. And you actually taught me a lot about how to look at this problem, about what remedies might be available that we're not looking at. And frankly, in just sharing your experiences through your book and your personal story, it made an indelible impression on me. And I'm grateful for that relationship that we have. Sarah, the hours I've spent with you, learning from you, whether it's on phone calls, emails, or even sharing a cup of coffee, either virtually or in person. I'm a better man for it, and I'm better at this job for it. Jared was actually one of my first people in fact, the first people. You walked in with Babak into my office on, I think, day 1 or 2. And that, if you know Jared, that's how he operates. Like never to let an opportunity waste. Jared heard there was a new SPIHA, and within like 24 to 48 hours, he was in my office actually educating me. And I'm grateful for the relationship that we have. And Nazar, although we're newer to each other in terms of relationship, I want to tell you that I actually have a box in my email chain that says Nazar on it, because when you give me something, I usually want to keep it and refer back to it later. So I'm surrounded by friends. I know for a fact that a lot of the people in the audience are people that I have relationships with. And because of that, we're able to learn from each other. We're able to share genuine trust, but you're also able to hold me accountable. And I appreciate that as well. This is not just a friendship, it's also a government working for its clients, its people, its customer. I work for you. I work for the families. I work for those that are detained and held hostage. And I work for the American government. And at times, my very close friends, which are to my right, are the ones that are going to, at times, give me my toughest comments, my toughest criticisms. And it's my hope that in doing so, we keep building that trust, and that I keep learning from you so that we can progress this hostage enterprise, as we call it, moving forward. Now, I'm mindful that not everyone in the audience or anyone who's listening knows what I do for a living. And so allow me to just start there and say that, first off, my title is horrifically long. And they say in DC, the longer your title is, the more unimportant you are. And so I'm definitely vying for that with the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. I had to take a breath halfway through that. We've truncated it to SPIHA, and SPIHA is essentially the organization, and me specifically, the person that's responsible for leading the U.S. government's diplomatic strategy to secure the release of U.S. hostage and wrongful detainees held captive abroad. Now, the creation of SPIHA occurred with the creation of Presidential Policy Directive Number 30, PPD 30. And that's why my office exists. It occurred in the wake of how the United States handled, and by the way, we didn't handle it well, how we handled some hostage crises in Syria in the 2014 timeframe. And that was a time that I don't think the United States really did quite a good job communicating with families. We weren't doing a very good job of talking to each other in the interagency, and we didn't really accord ourselves with honor and glory. And as a result, the President of the United States directed that we do a hostage policy review. This review resulted in this PPD 30 and also an executive order which created my office. It also created 2 other entities as well, the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell. Think of that as an interagency organization that's responsible for building the operational plans to bring people home, and also the Hostage Response Group at the National Security Council. They're essentially the group that tries to convene us all together to come up and implement these strategies, whether they're hostages, people taken by a terrorist group, or wrongful detainees, those taken by a nation state. Now, the families were involved in the creation. They were involved in the hostage policy review. The very people here and on these that are out in the audience by phone or by Zoom actually participated by giving their experiences, and that informed what we have today, these 3 different entities. But it also seemed to grow from these 3 government entities and what we all call the hostage recovery enterprise. So think of that not as just the U.S. government, but it's the families, it's the NGOs, it's the third-party intermediaries, it's Congress, it's staff members on the Hills. All these people getting together with one common interest, and that is bringing people home, taking care of the families, and eventually finding a way to deter this tough practice. Now, I still work with the families. I think a few of you know that I often go on a tagline that I talk to families 1 to 4 hours a day. I'd say in the last few days, it's probably been maybe 3 to 4 hours every single day, and that includes Saturday and Sunday. So talking with the families, listening to them, understanding their concerns, and trying to share some of the pain, anger, and grief that they're going through is a critical part of my organization's function. In fact, we've often said that if you want to work in my office, you have to come with bags of empathy, compassion, and passion. It's not a place for people who won't pick up the phone at 9 o'clock at night to talk to a family that's grieving. And we owe that to the families. I've been the recipient of their tough and just questions. I've been the recipient of some of their tears at times, but I'll tell you, I'm never going to shy away. My office will never shy away from those tears and those tough questions. My job is to embrace that, learn from you, and put that into trying to bring their loved ones home. Now, looking at the list of people who signed in, I know that there are some of the families of those American citizens that are being held wrongfully in Iran. I've spent a lot of time with them, and I would like to hear publicly say that my heart not only goes out to them, but I actually admire and appreciate everything that they've done to help me in learning how to do my job, frankly, and showing their honor and courage and strength. What they go through is almost unimaginable, and they've shown incredible resilience over an incredible amount of time. So if I may pay that honor to them, I'd like to do so. And I can also tell you that the reason that those families are out there, or rather the relationship we have, allows me to say that the administration, and specifically Secretary Blinken, Special Envoy Rob Malley, and myself are going to keep working tirelessly to make sure that we can bring their family members home. And we have to do that with actions, not just words. They have to see that we're trying to get this done on a day-to-day basis. Now, as everyone's aware, there are already indirect discussions with Iran on this urgent matter, and we've made it clear to the Iranian regime that these talks must proceed regardless of the negotiations related to the JCPOA. And while we fight for the return of these Americans, and we do so on a daily basis, we also have to keep in mind that there's got to be a deterrence factor. We can't just get people home and then constantly be doing this for the next 10, 20, 30 years, because some countries will do what we call restocking the pond. Once America gets their people back, they'll go and take a few more Americans, or in some cases, Germans, French citizens, Belgian citizens, and we've got to come up with a way that eventually deters that. And figuring out how we're going to do deterrence is pretty much going to be an all-hands-deck approach. We're going to have to get everyone within the U.S. government, and frankly, to start working with our allies, and to frankly, start working with my colleagues to my left and right on how we're going to try to get this done. Now, I've looked at people like, and I'll say, I'll pick Jared Genzer as a good example, and my friend John Franks. I've spent hours on the phone talking about deterrence. It's to our mind, it has to be more than just leveling sanctions against a country, although that is a valuable tool. We have to think of deeper tools. We have to expand our toolkit, and frankly, we have to come up with tools that have not yet been created and may require the help of Congress, or we may have to grab tools that we use for other situations, but can be repurposed to address this cause right here. So together, my sense is that not only can we work together to deter this horrific, I say, scourge on humanity, and as Secretary Blinken says, put it on the dustbin of humanity, but it's also going to allow us, I hope, to start pressuring people to give us back our citizens, which again, for us here right today, is the most important thing. So lastly, I'll kind of leave you with saying that we're often thought of in SPIHA as being a partner, and that's important to me. I want to make sure that everyone who's listening to my voice knows that what we do is partner. We partner with families, we partner with the people that run the NGOs, the think tanks, the people that wrestle with us on a daily basis, members of the media, members on Capitol Hill. We're here to partner and get this job done. But there's also responsibility on our shoulders to actually provide leadership and action. Because at the end of the day, you expect your government to do the things that only the government can do to bring people home. And that will be my intent, and that is my charge from Secretary Blinken and this administration. Holly, thank you for allowing me to talk on this topic. It's very important to me, and I cede the floor over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We're honored to have you. I'd like to now introduce the Washington Post opinions writer, Jason Rezaian. I first met Jason in 2012 at a trendy coffee shop in Meydan Tadrish, or Tadrish Square, back when he was the Tehran bureau chief. 2 years later, he was arrested along with his wife, a fellow journalist, Yeganeh Rezaian, in 2014. Jason's long detention felt deeply personal and was partly why I stopped visiting my family in Iran, a country where I had grown up. If authorities can go after a Western journalist from a world-renowned newspaper, it means that no one is exempt from the grasp of the Islamic Republic's intelligence apparatus. If you haven't already, I highly recommend reading Jason's memoir, Prisoner, and to also listen to Jason's podcast series, 544 Days on Spotify, which dives into his experiences at Evin Prison and the efforts to free him. Jason, over to you.
Thank you so much, Holly. Thank you, Ambassador Carstens. I want to say that you said we're all friends. I feel like this is kind of a family reunion. Everybody that I'm going to be talking to up here today, has become a real part of my life. And I think that that's a feeling that's shared amongst all of us. So if we are very comfortable with each other and very informal with each other, realize that that's because we have so much interaction. And I also want to say a special thanks to Ambassador Carstens. He has one of the most thankless jobs in government. We spend a lot of time talking. There are dozens of Americans who are wrongfully detained or held hostage around the world. And I know that in the depths of his soul, he doesn't feel like he's succeeding until all of those people come home. And that's why we're here today. We want people to come home, but we also want to put an end to this practice once and for all. He alluded to the presidential review of hostage policy that the Obama administration did back in 2014. I think I'm probably the first beneficiary of that review. And so much that's happened since has sort of come out of that. At the time that I was taken in 2014, the SPIHA job didn't exist. When I was released, it had just been established. And when it was established, it didn't cover cases like these Iran cases. We weren't part of that deal. That didn't happen until legislation named after Sarah's father, Bob Levinson, was enacted almost 2 years ago. That really kind of laid out for everyone that this sort of detention of Americans by foreign states is legally very similar to taking hostages. We've had a problem with saying that out loud, and I want to say that out loud at the get-go because today we'll be talking with experts in the field, but also victims of that. And I think one of the things that the victims and family members that we'll be hearing from all share is that belief that we or our loved ones were hostages of the Islamic Republic. And I feel like I'm going to need to repeat that multiple times because there are journalists in the room, there are colleagues in the room, there are professionals in the room who care about this issue. And if anything that you walk away with, understand that this is not something that governments do that is protected by international law or anything like that. This is hostage taking, and just take that as your first lesson of the morning. I want to introduce the first panelists. To my left is Sarah Moriarty, daughter of Bob Levinson. Bob was the longest held hostage in American history, taken in Iran in March of 2007, never to be heard from again. And this is a fate that no person should suffer, no family should suffer. Sarah and I have gotten to know each other over the past 6 years, working together to make sure that fewer and fewer families go through the kinds of ordeals that her family went through, that my family went through, Nazar's, Richard's, and others who we'll hear from today. Unfortunately, it continues to happen. So to Roger's point, we're not succeeding just yet, but hopefully we'll get there very soon. Nazar Zaka. I first learned of Nazar in September of 2015 as I sat in my cell in Evin prison. I had a television in my cell that played the entire suite of Islamic Republic broadcasting channels. On a news report, images of this man were flashed on the screen, and we were told that he was the greatest American super spy to be caught in Iran since me. And it was a very hard thing for me to swallow. The images that they showed were the kind of thing that they presented about me. I understood very clearly that the dots did not connect. This was a propaganda campaign against an innocent man. Nazar ultimately spent over 3 years in Evin prison. We will hear from him about that experience, and I think probably some of the similarities of our two experiences. Joining us from London is my dear friend, almost brother, Richard Radcliffe, who thankfully has been reunited with his wife, Nazanin. He's held for 6 years. Also, very similar story to Nazar's and mine. Nazanin was arrested at an airport in Iran in the spring of 2016, just 3 months after I was released, while Nazar was languishing in Evin prison. And from the very first weeks of Nazanin's captivity, Richard and I were in touch, trying to figure out ways that he could compel his government to do more to bring her home. And John Franks. I didn't meet John Franks until a couple months ago, but John was working with the family of Amir Hekmati, who was also released with me. My first images of John also came from Iranian state television. At the JCPOA meetings in Vienna in 2015, John, Montel Williams, who we worked with, my older brother, the family of Amir Hekmati, all traveled to Vienna to make sure that we hostages were not forgotten. The way that the Islamic Republic Broadcasting presented that was that this was part of a psychological warfare campaign directed by the U.S. government, and it was succeeding in diverting the attention from the issues that really matter. I would say that the conversations over the JCPOA are incredibly important, but this issue matters. This issue matters and should matter to all Americans. This is not a partisan issue. This is an American issue, and one that we have the opportunity, resources, and wealth of knowledge to address. And so that's what we're going to try and do here today. Sarah, I want to start with you. When your dad was abducted in 2007 on Quiche Island, what resources were available to you? Your father was a decorated member of the FBI. Presumably you had a lot of resources, or should have had a lot of resources available to you. Where did you guys go first?
So thank you, Jason, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for having me here. It's interesting you say that, because as I was listening to Roger speaking and talking about 2014 when the presidential policy directive came out, we had been doing this for 7 years at that point. I remember hearing from my mother what had happened and being told by different parts of the administration that, oh, it could be, we could get him released in a matter of days, it could be 6 years. And I actually remember at the 6-year mark thinking, oh, he's gonna come home now. But we started with nothing, really. My mom was just a housewife. She always stood in the shadows of my dad. My dad was bigger than life, and she always depended on him to lead the way. And she didn't know what to do, so she tried to trust the government. The FBI interacted with us. They actually told us at that time, we know that it's the Iranian government that's holding him, the Iranian regime that's holding him, but you're better off saying he's a hostage right now because you will get more resources if he's a hostage than a political prisoner. So we navigated through the dark blindly. And I remember in that first year, there was 5 or 6 other Iranian Americans that were picked up during that time. The Iranians never admitted to having my dad, which made it further complicated, but we watched as one by one they all came home, and we didn't know what to do or how to get their attention. There was infighting between the FBI and the CIA at the time. My mom was screaming at the State Department on a regular basis to nothing. We lost probably an entire year due to having no idea where to go. We didn't know how to talk to Congress. We didn't know how to even get in touch with Congress to get their help. So for the first several years, we just fought our way through and wrote our own playbook. At the end of that first year, my mom even tried to go over to Iran to get answers. And I think of things that Jonathan said before, where you're doing almost a dog and pony show to try to get whatever attention you can on the case. And I think Roger also said it best, we're just seeing deja vu over and over again. So we were able to see you come home in 2016, among others, but they just went back and picked up others over and over and over again. When my family started, there weren't that many people being held as political prisoners. Now we're seeing, as of today, at least 62 Americans in numerous countries being held for political gain. We're thankful that the Robert Levinson Act has now come about and put into law the PPD 30 that came out in 2014, but there's still so much more work to do.
You talk about the increasing number of people who have been detained in Iran and other countries. I really want people to think of this as serial crimes. This is really what this is. It's something that follows a pattern, and that pattern is very clearly visible in so many of these cases. Richard, I want to take it to you for a second. Sarah mentioned something about going to the government and trusting the government. I think your first instinct was probably to trust the UK government in their advice on how to approach Nazanin's arrest. Talk about that journey of trust.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think what Sarah said echoed hugely with our experience. So for those who don't know, Nazanin, my wife, who is now home, was on a family holiday in 2016 in March, and at the airport on the way home was picked up and disappeared. And she was there with our daughter, who was at that stage less than 2. So it just felt crazy. I had no experience of anything like that happening and no idea what was going on. I didn't even know that you told the government at the beginning. So we had a whole journey of discovery, much as Sarah has said, of going to the British government. The Foreign Office handles things here. We were treated as a consular case. So this is a regular British person got into trouble with the law overseas. And there was a very overstretched guy on the Iran desk who was dealing with a lot of very angry and terrified families. And he would, really struggling to have the bandwidth to be able to deal with them properly. And the government advice was to keep quiet. The government advice was to, we're hoping to improve relations with Iran and things will blow over. And we've just signed the nuclear deal, and we're hoping there'll be a sort of a trickle down effect. And that was what was being fed up the chain politically as well. So, we went public after about a month, and the reason I went public quite so early was because I, in the end, went out and met with different human rights groups, but actually different families. And it was hearing the first-hand experience of other families going through what we were going through, who all of them said, listen, well, there is no roadmap, there's no way through this that any of us know about. But for us in our case, we felt that we wish we'd gone public earlier. And sat there thinking, gosh, I feel the same. I just think, this is such, I don't know what's going on, but it's just so wrong that surely talking about it can only help. But yeah, we encountered an awful lot of resistance from the British government and from received wisdom, really, more broadly amongst stakeholders about, the Iranians are very sensitive and you keep quiet, and the way things are solved are through quiet diplomacy. So we had a long battle that became very public, and that involved, really, Dog and Pony Show is not a bad example, trying to bring attention to Nazanin's case, trying to bring attention to the injustice specifically, and then the wider phenomenon, and to link up with other families. And you were very helpful, Nazar was very helpful, Sarah was very helpful, many other people have shared their experiences, and we found huge strength from that common experience, from realizing there was a playbook, that it wasn't especially being done to us, it was just a way of processing that the Islamic Republic had, and actually pushing our government and pushing other governments to recognise that this is hostage taking and that it needs to be called as such. But certainly, at the moment, interestingly, so Nazanin came back eventually this spring. So we're in a lovely sort of survivor space now. It's bumpy. Definitely a whole process of adjusting back to the world. But we're in the middle of an inquiry, and the British Parliament is doing around state hostage taking and what could the British government do better. And it's clear that we're still struggling for answers. It's not clear that the government in the UK feels it's necessarily made, or willing to acknowledge it's made many mistakes, let alone to understand that there are any sort of great insight out there as to what could be done better.
One thing that you said, Richard, that you were advised to keep quiet, that this will blow over. if I want to pass on another piece of wisdom from the group, these things never blow over. It's not, nobody is arrested, no foreign national is arrested in Iran by mistake. There's an intentionality to these cases. Keeping quiet has never proven to be a successful tact for anyone. And I think that you know, I and others owe Richard a debt of gratitude for his tenacity and his unwillingness to back down. And I think history will show that he's been a wonderful advocate for hostages around the world. And kudos to you, Richard.
Thank you. Jason, just one thing to add. For me, I think the really important thing about speaking out is that it keeps you safe. If there's a transparency to the case or a profile to the case, it limits the abuse that can happen, and it limits the indulgence of that abuse. In our case, it always felt that transparency was on our side, and that the more we talked about our case, the more it would become clear what it was about. In our case, it was about some money that the UK owed Iran, and Iran wanted back, and it's being incredibly ruthless about. But the thing I think you never know in all these cases, as all of us families, as to what is going to get our loved one home. But I absolutely know that transparency and openness and being loud keeps your loved one safe.
That's 100% correct. I've written dozens of stories on this issue. I've never had a hostage return home and say, Jason, I wish you had not written about me. That doesn't happen. Nazar, you and I have a lot in common, a lot of shared history. I want you, as the person up here today who has been through this horrible experience, to talk a little bit about the realities of being a hostage and the recognition. I mean, certainly you were abducted on your way to the airport. You didn't realize why, but it became clear to you over time. Talk to us about that understanding of what you were being held for.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Jason, as you know, I was just invited by the Vice President of Iran to go to attend a conference, and on my way back to the airport, I just was like stopped by civilians, and it took me, I didn't even know where I'm going. I was going, and I was thrown in a room 2 by 4 meters, and we had to walk the diagonal it's a longer walk inside the room. I spent some time, and then one day when you left, they moved me to your room. Exactly. So you feel like we are a product. Exactly. So one guy is leaving, the next guy is on the shelf. They're selling us. It's a business model. They're doing a complete business model from the day they identify the person they want to take hostage, to the way they put him on a fake trial, and then to the promotion. They start promoting you and doing all this, like marketing the product and then selling the product. This is the 4 stages that we go through. So this is what I have been going through, and I went into your room. We spent. I know everything you had, because so it was very hard. And then I was moved after that to public jail, with amniyati, security jail, which is also you get a new expertise from being alone in a solitary confinement to being in a room with 24 people on triple deck, triple bed. So it's crazy time. And I didn't speak the language. I don't know what I'm going. I was just for a few days, and then I go into this black hole. The funny part is that before I left, before January, when they did in January 2016, when they did the swap, I was called by the IRGC security, and they told me call the State Department and tell them to include you in the swap. So I never believed that I should do that. I refused to do that. And till today, I don't know if it was a mistake or not. Because when you are a hostage, you always feel that the outside is doing the right thing. You don't need to do anything. You just have this intention that they know better. You should stay quiet. You should not cooperate. You should. And in fact, every time we talk here, and I see Roger, we always are referring to the family, how to please the family. There is another aspect. It's very important, the family to be pleased, but there is a factor, the morale of the hostage. It's so important, the morale of the hostage, because it's so damaging. And till today, we are still getting, like we all, nobody can sleep, also former hostages, we need pills, so this is a part that we really, I think we are missing the understanding of what the hostage is feeling when he is left behind. The time I was left, I couldn't believe it that I will stay 4 years. And the same today, Siamak, when Siamak is left behind, I cannot believe that he's still there. And we need to do more, we need to be more outspoken, and what Jason you're doing is so important, because even a small tweet about the hostage, if he knows about it, he has like an energy, a new oxygen for him. So one more thing that happened also, like the day Nazanin came, okay, in April, I guess, 2016, we heard her screaming that night. We were all in Dua Aleph in the intelligence of the IRGC, and we all felt and we all knew what's going on. And it was like everybody, they knew exactly what they want. They had a plan, and we were all falling in this plan. And unless we find a way to intercept the business model, they have to stop it. It will not end. They will release someone the same day, they will get another one, and they put it, and they arrest them for no reason. I have no reason. I was invited. I spoke at a conference, and they took me. So I don't know what to say. Jason, you know better how we went through, what you went through, the pain, the horror, and it's difficult to talk about every time.
It's very difficult to talk about. But another thing that I wanted to point out is that this, and I think Richard and Nazar can attest to this. This is not a very sophisticated thing that the IRGC and other elements of the Iranian regime are doing. And unfortunately, I think the public posturing of the US government, the British government, Canadian governments, other governments who've dealt with this is so flat-footed, right? We talk about each one of these cases as if it's the first time that this is ever happening to us. Actually, there's a huge body of evidence. There are dozens of cases that we can point to. In Nazar's case, he just told you, the day that I left, they put him in my bed. A few weeks later, I don't know how you were able to smuggle this letter out. Somebody, I was attending an event here in Washington, D.C., they came to me with their cell phone, and they had photographs of a letter, part of which Nazar had written to me, talking about the cellmate that I left, that Nazar inherited. This is, it's all interconnected. There are so many crumbs, so many trails that we can piece together, so much to be learned from each one of these cases. And we should look at them, as I said earlier, as serial crimes.
And we had the same interrogator.
We had the same interrogator.
One day he got me a paper. He never say one word, one word of truth. And one day he sent me a letter. He said, "You see this letter? Jason was trying to sneak it out through his wife." And I didn't believe him. When I came out, I asked Jason, "Is that true?" He said, "Yes, that's true."
It's true, and now it's in Judge Salavati's office, and he waves it for other hostages and says, "Don't be like Jason." John, I want to talk to you about your work on these cases going back several years. You worked on Amir Hekmati's case as an advocate, a public advocate, Michael White's, Trevor Reed's most recently, and other families. How important is it for the families of hostages, American hostages, to raise these cases publicly? What's your experience in that realm?
My experience is sort of informed by speaking to former hostages like you, like Nazar, like Amir, like Michael. I've never had one tell me that they wish their family was less loud. It's always, why weren't you more loud, right? So I think over the years, we've kind of pioneered a high-pressure way of getting people out by exerting pressure on our own government. And it does seem to work, most recently in Trevor Reed's case. So I think it's important, and it's a hard thing for families because it's scary to be out and be public. You don't know what's going to happen next. It's somewhat unpredictable. So it doesn't surprise me that families struggle with it, but I think in the end they largely come to the conclusion that they have no choice but to be loud in public, and that when they do, it is protective in a lot of ways. I mean, it may get somebody sent to solitary, but it raises the stakes for the hostage taker significantly.
And in the handling of these cases, you've become more confident in that approach. I mean, you're certainly out in front of this with literally dozens of families at this point right now. Can you talk about those kind of growing, coalescing efforts?
Absolutely. And I think when Trevor Reed was released, it injected a new energy into the families. This administration had resisted, and I'm not talking about Roger and his team, I'm talking about, at the White House, had resisted what I would call more avant-garde tactics to get people back. And the prisoner trade for Trevor, which I thought the United States objectively got the better end of, led people to believe maybe there'll be more deals, right? So the families are organizing now. They are organized. They're taking actions. In early May, they held a protest outside of the White House. We've announced that next Wednesday, we're going to put a mural, a wheat paste mural on the side of a building in Georgetown. And we're going to make it impossible for folks to forget or ignore these families. And what we're looking for really is for the decision makers at the White House to go send Roger out to clear the decks. And I think it's a doable thing in at least 15 cases.
If I might add, Jason, I think the key with Iran is that my family has seen over the years, they only respond to pressure. So they're a bully, right? And the only way to get a bully to listen to you is to punch them in the nose. And we have not punched them in the nose. And we need to find a way to punch them in the nose.
I think that the reality is they have many noses, right? And so often we've kind of said, no, this member of the Iranian regime, this foreign minister, he's a good guy, he's like us, he talks like us, he's educated the way we are. This is all part of a very elaborate Ponzi scheme, right? That has ensnared dozens of Americans. We don't have a ton more time. I have a couple more questions. I want to pose this to both Sarah and to Nazar. Both of you have used these horrible experiences that your families and yourself have experienced for good, to try and to propel this issue to the consciousness, both in legal terms and in public terms. Can you talk about your work with the Foley Foundation and in advocating for legislation that's named after your dad? And also, Nazar, I'd like you to talk about hostage aid worldwide and your efforts.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. So back to the other point of pressure, I think you, of anyone, know how much you helped me and my family to put that pressure on Iran. And so after this months-long campaign of putting as much pressure on Iran as possible and truly embarrassing them, we finally got some answers. Not enough answers, but at least one answer about my dad in March of 2020. And when that happened, we released it publicly at the end of March because COVID was happening. And Diane Foley reached out to me at that time and she said, do you want to honor your father's legacy and be part of the Foley Foundation? And of course my answer was yes. And in my head, if I can help one person come home where we weren't able to get my dad home, then I will have made a difference. My family fought really hard to get the Robert A. Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act into law. You talk about long titles. And so it codifies into law PPD 30, but there's so much more work to be done with that. It also creates criteria for wrongful detention. So there's finally a true acknowledgement of these political prisoners that are being held in these rogue nations. So wrongful detentions are really a thing, where they've always been something that happens, but now there's a law saying you have to take care of these people who are wrongfully detained. But there's so much more we have to do to push because we're still not getting people home. I've been on the board of the Foley Foundation for 2 years, and only recently have we started to see anyone come home. So there's still so much more that we can do. We're hoping to see a second version of the Levinson Act come out. We've been talking to a lot of families, and there will be a report from the Foley Foundation coming out in August, talking about how much more we can be doing through the Levinson Act and other legislation to bring Americans home.
Look, the work that the Foley Foundation does has been instrumental in this, and I think that we're starting to hear more about wrongful detainees. Obviously, the Brittany Griner case has raised that to a national level, but this is something that's getting covered now. And we've been covering it at the Washington Post for a long time, but now that you see it on television, and that's a huge difference. That's not something that was happening before. Nazar, talk about Hostage Aid Worldwide, the organization that you founded.
So we founded this organization after I came out. We went to the UNGA in 2019, and we had all the families and all the former hostages together, and we decided to work together in order to set some entities that represent, like, to have a certain voice for the former hostages. And so the purpose was to complement the effort that is already being done by the Foley Foundation and other, which is a wonderful effort they have done. So as former hostages, we try to work together and to try to see how to get some data related to the hostages over the years, especially like now we have like we said initially, we started with this idea with Barry Rosen, who was a hostage in 1979 at the US Embassy in Tehran, because we felt that the same thing is happening all over the years. Since 1979 till today, it's exactly the same system. So we worked, and we wanted to try to best represent or think how the hostage is thinking while he is incarcerated, and this is the purpose of our work. We're using some data in order to try to identify what is the best solution for the families to use in order to release their hostages.
And I want to say that Nazar has been incredible at bringing current hostage families and former hostages together. You're a great convener. It's part of your Lebanese nature, I think. But it's been a wonderful thing to experience. John, you wanted to add something, and then I want to go to Richard.
Yeah, you said that the issue is now really finally getting coverage, and I think that's correct. I think that's part of the sea change we saw after Trevor Reed, and part of that's attributable to Brittany Griner. And the Family Campaign and others, we're actively looking for other ways to make this impossible to ignore.
If I might add,
Sure.
He's also been a huge advocate of we're trying to get a hostage flag to be flown at post offices under the POW MIA flag. So hopefully we can convince Congress to do that. But he's got the flag on his lapel pin, and I think it would be a great representation to bring attention to this for all Americans.
Members who are listening today, it's a wonderful idea. I think that there's a sample ready to go of that flag.
And it's PAYGO compliant. They don't have to offset.
It is.
Make it happen. Richard, I want to talk, now that you and Nazanin and Gabriella have been reunited, I think one of the things that people don't understand is this is not a theoretical problem. This is something that affects individuals, families, communities, workspaces. There are ripple effects that spread out. Talk about how you all are doing, coming back together, but also, the way forward and the hope that you have for the future after having 6 years of your life as a family stolen from you.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Jason. It's, I think that's right. It's for all of us. It was 6 years on hold, 6 years of living day to day, and 6 years of surviving. And thankfully for us, that is over. And there was a lovely euphoric day, and then there's a process of catching life back up. And Nazanin comes back with her ghosts. I have my ghosts, and there's kind of a way in which for 6 years you're so focused on one thing and just battling to reach one point, and then the rest of life comes flooding back in, and you notice it in ways in which it's an adjustment, and it's when I was telling others families, there's anger, there's disorientation, there's an overwhelming sort of. I mean, in our case, because we were very high profile, there's a lovely rush of care and concern and warmth and support, which is profoundly important for keeping Nazanin safe and for getting her home. But it can be overwhelming some days. And yeah, I think, Gabriella, our daughter, was less than 2 when this started, is now 8. For a long time, she didn't really believe her mum was coming home. And when her mum does come home, there's some happy times. But yeah, she's adjusting to having, 2 bosses or 2 servants, depending on which day it is. I think it is very nice to sit here as a survivor, and to sit here and to be a reassurance to all those who are still in the middle of it, that one day it does end. And it's not simple. I remember people saying to me, don't expect, this is the really hard part, the readjustment, and it is hard. But it is so much easier to let all that stress and that worry and that panic and that perpetual battling with your own government, with foreign governments to fade away. I think there's a really important question everyone's been raising about, sharing that experience with others that are going through it. Our experience will be different from others, and they have to make their own choices. But I was really, really treasured the insights I gained from former hostages, including yourself and your brother, but including many others who offered their thoughts along the way. And I do think, as a sort of a family of survivors and a family of those going through it, that it remains really important for me to, that accountability piece, that piece to discourage this practice from continuing as a way of moving beyond it, I think will be crucial for us in the months ahead.
It is an incredible testament to you, Richard, to Nazanin, Gabriella, Sarah, your entire family, Nazar, you and your family. Not everybody is built to continue this fight after the fact. And in your family's case, you haven't had the same kind of closure. And, the willingness to continue to engage is not only admirable, it's affirming, I think, for the rest of us who want to see an end to this problem. And it's also affirming to have people like John who are willing to commit so much time and energy. I talked about Roger's job being rather thankless. John, your job ain't that more, not a lot of thanks involved. Jared, David, Carlo, who we'll be hearing from later. This is not something that is, it's something that gets a lot of pats on the back for. And you all deserve those pats on the back. And I look forward to continuing the conversation about deterrence and accountability. Right now, we are going to do a Q&A. And can I take questions from the audience? On the iPad. I've got questions right here. I haven't even looked at this thing. Let's take a look. How much time do I have for questions?
About 10 minutes.
Okay, great. So we have a question from a woman named Sarah. The ambassador talked about tools to be developed to deter the Iranian regime from taking hostages. What are some examples? I know we'll get to that in the second panel, but do you guys have any that you'd like to mention?
So I think we have to find ways to cause pain for the people doing this, but do it without violating anybody's human rights. So one idea that I've seen, and admittedly it was about countering the Russians, not the Iranians, but it would be great if Western Europe, North American boarding schools would kick out nationals of countries that take hostages that are not on financial aid. That allows us not to penalize people that are working hard to get their kids out. But if you're paying $70,000 a year for high school tuition, you're an elite and you're benefiting from it. And I think tactics like that are more likely to impact this even than sanctions. Make it impossible for them to enjoy the Western world.
Richard, you and I have talked about this very issue a lot, and there's an American perspective to this, but there's also an international one. What are some of the things that you see as possible routes to deterrence?
So there's lots of things to think about, and there's the scales of how aggressive one wants to be. The thing that we're doing right now is we filed for Magnitsky sanctions. Those are sanctions on individuals, so Magnitsky sanctions on hostage takers. Those freeze assets, and those are travel bans. We filed them in the UK and we filed them in Europe. We will be filing the same names in the US and Canada and Australia. We've been doing that with a number of families behind closed doors, in participation also from a number of hostage organisations. Done that in phase one. There'll be 2 more phases of names as we are able to substantiate people who are directly involved. I think John's absolutely right that there needs to be a clear link between those who are perpetrating these acts and that there's a clear cost to them. There are other legal avenues. There are things that can be done at the UN, and there are those better placed this afternoon or later on to talk about it. But for me, certainly, I think the next year will be focused very much on pushing for Magnitsky sanctions on the key perpetrators.
Ambassador Carson's talked about learning from all of us and our collective experience. I want to point out that, as victims and survivors, it's not our job to figure out how to deter countries like Iran from doing this. But we've all taken this job on because for far too long, our governments have been not only failing on this subject, failing us personally as individuals, and others we'll hear from today. So, this is something that we've all invested a lot of time and energy in, and I don't think that we're going to stop. Another question, though, is what's our advice collectively for how normal, everyday citizens in our societies should react to these hostage crises? Do they have a role to play? What is an action that your neighbor can take when they hear that someone has been taken hostage? I put it to all of you, and I'm happy to hear. Nazar, go ahead.
I believe when it's the hostage, when it's half the pain is coming from the outside and the other half is from the inside. The captors inflict half the pain, and that's why it's very. If the hostage knows that his family is taken care of and his loved one is taken care of, he will be much stronger. That's why we believe that all the community. It's very important the community to help the hostage family and assist them, especially their kids, their sons, in order for you on the inside to be able to do the fight.
If I might add, I think the American public needs to show that they really, truly care about this issue, and we need them to call the White House or call the Congress, make it such a big issue that the government can't ignore it. I've heard before that when people were sending letters to the White House, that was when the government really cared about things with my dad, when it became such a public issue that they couldn't not pay attention. Yeah. And I also just want advice, not just for people who are watching, but for anyone who experiences this, because it could be anyone. It could be anyone traveling to a foreign country that doesn't think about it, that doesn't even realize it. But when it does happen, you mentioned it earlier, to scream it from the rooftops and not just wait. Richard, we waited a month too before we let it out publicly. Not just wait a month, start screaming it as early as you can, because that's the way it'll get the attention that it deserves.
Richard?
I think that's absolutely right. I think the importance of visible caring and the importance of witnessing, so seeing the injustice, visibly caring about it, whether that's tying a yellow ribbon somewhere, whether that's sending a letter to Congress or to Parliament in our case, it all really helps for people to know they're not alone. It helps for the person inside prison to know. Eventually, it certainly helps their family to know. Hugely important for getting through something like this.
Can I add one more thing, Jason? One thing that I did also want to say is I asked the media to pay attention to this. So when all of these families are going through this, we're at the mercy of the media putting it as a story. So you've been great about writing articles about it, but I would ask the media to put a spotlight on it as often as they can. If someone's interviewing a foreign official from Iran, make sure to ask a question about the hostages there. Same with Russia. Same with the Ukraine. Ukraine even has people being held.
Yeah. And
I'm sorry, Ukraine.
I'm glad to see some journalistic colleagues in the crowd today. I also want to point out something that I think gets forgotten. This is not just a problem for us who are dealing with this right now. The rise in the number of wrongful detention cases has been precipitous over the last several years. And one thing that I often talk about when I engage in discussions with American officials, but officials from other countries, is that there are several dozen cases right now that Roger is dealing with. What's going to happen when it's several hundred cases? Because we're moving in that direction. If we don't get this deterrent piece in place soon, you're going to be dealing with the tidal wave, an avalanche of cases around the world. And at that point, the value of your blue passport will sink dramatically. And so I want people to think about this as something, as you mentioned, that could affect anybody, right? When Nazanin went home to visit her folks for a holiday, there was no expectation that this was going to happen. When Nazar went to Iran to speak at a conference where he was invited by the Iranian government, by one of the highest officials in that country, there was no expectation that this was going to happen. And so, I'm glad that we've had the opportunity to discuss with these folks. We're going to take a break in a moment to kind of regroup. But first, we're going to show a short video from the family of Emad Shahri, who is an Iranian American, a longtime resident of the District of Columbia, currently being held in Iran in a Evin prison. And then we're going to take a short break.
I would like to thank the Atlantic Council for inviting us to this panel and for letting us speak. Thank you very much. It has been 4 long years of a nightmare that I cannot wake up from, that I want to wake up from. It has been 4 years since my husband, Emad Shahri, an innocent American, has been detained in Iran in the notorious Evin prison. He has missed numerous birthdays, anniversaries. He has missed the graduation of both of our daughters from university. But mostly, we have missed him every single moment of our lives, as he has missed us. Each time I visit his elderly parents, I can see that their eyes are glued to the door, waiting for the day that their son comes back and they are able to hold him in their arms. Ariana and Hannah, 2 young ladies who are constantly trying to be strong, who are constantly supportive, going to all the lawyers' meetings, State Department meetings and such with me. This is really not what they are supposed to do as young ladies at this time. They just want their father back. I beg President Biden to please make this as part of his legacy. The bringing back of our loved ones, of the hostages and wrongfully detained abroad back. Thank you.
This 4th of July marked our dad's 40th anniversary of moving from England to America. And he told me that he could see the fireworks flying in from the airport to North Fork Airport in Virginia. And I was really hoping he could have been doing the same this year, flying back home after having been held in Iran for 4 years. I really hope that the Biden administration makes this a humanitarian issue and not a political issue, and does everything they can to bring unjustly detained Americans back home. We have missed our dad every single day and have lived our lives day to day, because every day without him is truly a day lost. And I just hope that tomorrow is the day that he's finally home and we're able to see him and hold him after so many years.
I don't think I can accurately convey the amount of pain our family has been through over the past 4 years. We've waited for months at a time to hear his voice over the phone to know if he's even alive. We haven't been able to hug him. At this point in his life, my dad should be on a walk in our neighborhood with my mom, relaxing after the years and years of work he has done providing for our family. And instead, he's rotting in a jail cell in Iran for no reason other than the fact that he is an American. Our dad is an innocent man, but much more than that, he is a very good man. Just the fact that he's innocent should be enough to bring him home, but he is the most patient, the most kind, the most loving person I have ever met. I have been blessed with this amazing father, and now he has been ripped away from us for absolutely no reason. I ask that the American public raise awareness around the hostages and wrongfully detained, and I ask that the president makes it a priority to bring these Americans home. Thank you.
thank you everyone for staying with us for the second part of today's discussion about hostage diplomacy, Iran's state hostage taking. We're going to move on to part of the discussion that deals with the legal aspects of this and the challenges posed by Iranian hostage taking. Joining me are three experts in the field, people that I've gotten to know in different ways over the last several years. First, joining us from, are you in London, Carla? Is that where you are today?
Close by. I'm in the UK.
Carla Firstman in the UK, who is a university at the Essex School of Law and Human Rights Center in the UK, who worked closely with Richard Radcliffe for the last several years. I want to speak to you specifically about what you learned in that process. To my friend Jared Genser, who is the pro bono counsel for Siamak and Baghar Namazi. As we learned in the first panel, Siamak was detained at the same time that Nazar and I were detained in Iran back in 2015. Siamak was left behind in the deal that was made along with Nazar, who was released in 2019. Siamak is still there. His father, who went to Iran to advocate on his son's behalf, was then detained, still being held under house arrest. Siamak has been in Evin prison for over 2,500 days. Wrote and published a very powerful op-ed in the New York Times just a few days ago. I encourage you all to read that. And David Bowker, who is with the law firm Wilmer Hale. Wilmer Hale was hired by the Washington Post to lead efforts around their attempts to get me out of prison in Iran. So I have a special relationship with David and owe him a real debt of gratitude, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Carla, I want to start with you. You've been dealing with arbitrary and wrongful detention cases for many years. Talk about what you learned in the process, in the initial stages of Nazanin's detention, and how that evolved over these past 6 years.
Thank you. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I think what's important to note is that we didn't really have a playbook. It wasn't really clear what was going to work because it wasn't obvious that Iran had a very clear way of responding. So the most important thing for me or for us was to really understand as best as we could what was driving the family, Richard and the family's activism, and how best we could support it. So it wasn't really about saying, well, do this is a better approach, or do that, it's a different approach. There was a bit of a recognition that all cases are going to be different and families' motivations are going to differ. And given that there is no clear answer, I think, really what we wanted to do is support the families and find a way in which to basically to enhance or to expand their access to advice, to basically help them to mobilize action in whatever possible way we could.
And it's a multi-pronged fight, right? I mean, there are legal concerns involving the laws of the Islamic Republic and representing your client while they're there, but also trying to activate the home government, who is ultimately going to be responsible for securing the release. Jared, you've been working on arbitrary and wrongful detention cases for years. You've literally written the book on the subject. What about Iran has posed different challenges than other countries that you've worked on?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and thank you to the Atlantic Council and Jason for hosting this. I have been working on political prisoner cases over my 20-year career, and the Islamic Republic is unique in a number of respects. First, it has a state policy of hostage-taking, and as described before by Nazar, a whole strategy around taking of hostages, marketing them, and selling them back. And Worse than that, they've been very successful and effective at it. And so the behavior has been repeatedly reinforced as something that has earned them enormous amounts of policy concessions and billions of dollars of financial resources. And so I think that that is undoubtedly a unique challenge. The other unique challenge as compared to other political prisoner cases, when you're talking about American hostage cases, is, in ordinary political prisoner cases, when you represent, for example, a dissident in a foreign country that stands up to a government, you can mobilize global support. But in the case of the American hostages in Iran, it has to ultimately be a bilateral agreement between the United States and Iran. And at various times, one or the other government does or does not want to come to the table. And it's this horrific dance over years and years and years where, when Iran wants to come to the table, the U.S. doesn't want to come to the table. When the U.S. comes to a table, Iran goes the other direction. And ultimately, there are enormous political pressures in our own system of government here in Washington that makes it very, very difficult to cut these deals over time.
You mentioned the bilateral nature of these deals. Carla, in the efforts to free Nazanin, it's my understanding that there was a certain amount of coordination between the U.S. And UK governments, that they were going to have a unified front. And at some point, not too long ago, the British government decided that they were going to go it alone. And I think one of the things that I often talk about with all of you and others is the importance of developing multilateral approaches to this problem. That's not something that has been successfully attempted yet. I think oftentimes we deal with these cases one by one and aren't doing the heavy lifting of figuring out how can we respond to this collectively. Without betraying any confidences, I've been speaking with diplomats from several EU countries about their own cases, and there has been more public conversation about the need for this collective approach. But unfortunately, that hasn't actually come together just yet. And it's something that we can look forward to. David, I want to bring you into it. You and your colleagues at WilmerHale were engaged by the Washington Post within hours of my arrest in Tehran. For the next 540-something days, you were focused on figuring out ways to get me out. You learned a lot more about Iranian law than I think you'll ever care to use, and you also learned a lot about advocating for American citizens right here in the town that you live in. Talk about the process and what worked and what didn't.
Well, I learned a lot about Iranian law. I also learned a lot about Jason Rezaian and his family. I got to know everyone in Jason's family quite well over the course of that work. And that's the thing about these cases, is they're so personal and so familial, and you become part of a community. Jared taught me that a long time ago. I think I did my first case in this area for a nonprofit that Jared founded, Freedom Now, many years ago. I think it was probably 15, 16 years ago, and have been doing these cases ever since. You ask a great question about the coordination between and among countries. I represent now Murad Tabaz, who is a US, UK, Iranian trinational who is held hostage in Iran at this moment. And coordination is critical among the governments. And one of our tasks as council was to coordinate closely with each of the interested governments, obviously not the Iranian government, dealing with them adversely, but dealing with the US and UK governments and others who would help. And what Mr. Radcliffe said earlier in the earlier panel was so interesting to me. What he was told by the UK government was sort of the opposite of what actually worked. That was our experience as well. The UK government advised us to be quiet. In reality, you need to be loud. They told us that Murad is not a hostage. He's rather a criminal defendant, and that's actually wrong. He's a hostage, and even the Iranians have admitted it. presidential commission convened by the Iranian president, then President Rouhani, consisting of cabinet members, declared him to be innocent and said he should be set free. That was 2.5 years ago. They've got no legal basis to hold him, no witnesses against him, no documents, no crimes he committed. He's just a hostage, pure and simple, and the UK government had trouble coming to terms with that fact, or at least dealing straightforwardly with it. And then said to us that they don't pay ransom, and yet they just did. Just paid £400 million for the release of 2 hostages, and tragically left Murad behind, even though they said they wouldn't. And so we recognize that governments are limited in what they can do because they're dealing with another government. We recognize that. But what governments can do, and what we rely on them to do, is to be straightforward, is to tell the truth, and to keep their word. And when governments don't do that, families pay the price, hostages pay the price, and it's not right, it's not fair. We are now working to get the UK government to deliver on its word, which is that in the deal they struck, they told us Murad was granted furlough, and that hasn't happened. And it's unclear why, or whether that deal was actually struck. So and because we're dealing with a state-sponsored criminal, or it's basically state-sponsored organized crime, is what we're dealing with. And individuals and families, and even groups of individuals and families, can't compete with state-sponsored organized crime. That's a formidable adversary. And so we have to rely on states to confront that adversary. And what I am troubled by is the reluctance of our governments to acknowledge, as Sarah Moriarty said, to acknowledge that sometimes the organized crime, the perpetrator of the organized crime just needs to be punched in the nose. Yeah. And you need to stand up to the bully.
Jared, please.
Let me pause there.
Yeah, well, I just want to add, because we're talking about multilateral approaches. One idea I've been kicking around, and I have a working draft of something that I can share with anyone who's interested, is the idea of creating a multilateral treaty among like-minded states to stop state-sponsored hostage taking. And the concept is that every country that would sign on to that treaty would commit to considering working individually and collectively in all cases where hostages have been identified as being detained, with up to, I have about a dozen different examples of actions that could be taken individually and multilaterally. And then if a state involves in a state practice of hostage taking more broadly, then there are another 20 measures that could be potentially considered to be adopted by, individually or collectively by this group. It won't compel any country in the world that signs this treaty to undertake any actions, because we would never get countries to sign on to such a convention. But I think that as a matter of deterrence, it could be an incredibly valuable tool to not only be very clear that all the countries that sign on are committed to working together in a NATO-like, an attack on one is an attack on all, but also to lay out very, very specifically the wide array of specific measures that could be put in place in response to state-sponsored hostage taking.
I've had discussions with Ambassador Carstens about similar plans, and I hope that we can all convene collectively to continue pushing that sort of agenda forward. Carla, I want to come back to you. Something that you all talked about a lot in Nazanin's case was the legal protection gap that existed within UK law. I think, part of where we stumble is that, as David mentioned, when one of our citizens is arrested abroad, in what is clearly, to those of us who've experienced this or who work on this, know is a hostage case, and the home government says, no, that's a legitimate judicial process in a sovereign nation. How do we get beyond that, right? Because it's very clear to everybody who works on this issue that this is a crime It's an organized serial crime that gets perpetrated over and over and over again. How do we break through that red tape within, a government like yours?
Well, I think it's really important that we do, because essentially the delay, that not recognizing that this is a hostage-taking situation causes, and treating it like a normal drug case or some other kind of person who gets into trouble abroad, means that a huge amount of time is wasted and the families are being misdirected. So it's got to happen. In a way, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has been stepping in and making findings that these cases amount to arbitrary detention, but that isn't a long-term solution. The governments themselves need to have really the capacity to understand the difference and to take action quickly. Secondly, the protection gap in the UK has to do with the lack of obligation to take specific effective measures in relation to consular assistance, diplomatic protection. So we really think that it's important that further work is done in this area, because as was said right at the beginning of this conference, governments are there to support their citizens. And that's got to be a fundamental principle. We have to get back to that. And if it requires changing the law to recognize that better, then that's what we must do.
I want to pose this to all three of you, but I'm going to start with David because it was central to efforts to free me. At what point do you come to that realization that we are not going to see the Iranian regime do the right thing? They are not going to release this innocent person. This person is a hostage. We've talked a bit earlier about the lack of evidence or witnesses in any of the cases that Nazar, Nazanin, myself, Morad, Siamak and Bagher, Ahmad Shargi, none of us have ever had anybody testify against us. There's never been a piece of evidence. I've seen the legal briefings, the casework that you guys did on my behalf. At what point do you come to this realization that, our job is to get the home government to give a damn? When did that happen in our case?
In your case, day one. And the reason I say that is because I'm a public international lawyer by training, and I started my career at the Department of State as a lawyer for the U.S. government in foreign relations. And so the instinct is to treat as legitimate the judiciary of a foreign country. That's how our international system works. That's the presumption. There is deference to the judiciary of all the other countries with which we deal as a presumptive matter, as a matter of international law. That presumption needs to go away and should go away with respect to certain states and certain kinds of cases. There are countries, and Iran happens to be at the top of the list, but it's not the only one, where with respect to political detentions, you know from day one, this isn't legitimate. This fits a pattern. This is part of a strategy of a ring of criminals who use this tactic for leverage, both for their own personal political gain, sometimes their own personal financial gain, and for particular political concessions for their country. That's not a legitimate function of a judiciary, and so we need to do away with that presumption with respect to certain states, and Iran is at the top of the list. That was clear in your case, as you pointed out. They never introduced a single document or witness with any credibility at all in any court of law to suggest that any of the preposterous allegations had any merit at all in your case.
If I could just mention about Siamak and Bagher Namazi on that point. Siamak Namazi did have evidence actually presented against him. The evidence was that he had been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars for the National Endowment for Democracy, and that he had been a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. And they said the World Economic Forum, for example, is an American spy organization. And of course, we argued in response to that at the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, well, if it's a spy organization, why don't you arrest President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif, who regularly go to Davos to speak at this American spy organization? So there are some cases where evidence is brought up, but Bakr Namazi never had any evidence presented against him, and in both cases, you're talking about one-day trials, summary judgments, and ultimately 10-year prison sentences for Siamak and Bakr.
Yeah, these are sham proceedings.
So we know that, and we continue to see it happening over and over again. What do we need to do to compel the US, the UK, Canadian, EU governments, the Australian governments to, cut the crap and get up to speed with you? Why does it take the US government 4 months, 5 months, 8 months, a year, several years, sometimes to make that determination that someone is being wrongfully detained? And I do this maybe in the frustration of Ambassador Carstens. When we talk about wrongful detentions, we are talking about state hostages. This is a diplomatic euphemism. I don't like to use the word wrongful detention. State hostages. When someone is taken hostage by a state, why can't our governments say that on day one?
So I think our governments have competing interests, and it's hard, I think, for the governments to do everything exactly as we would wish in hostage cases, because they have a variety of interests that they need to attend to, including, for example, in the case of Iran, the development of a nuclear program and all of the geopolitics that go with it. So, we recognize that that the tail of the hostages can't always wag the dog of state. But on the other hand, I do think the governments can do the job that Ambassador Carstens does of being straightforward with the families, telling them exactly what's happening, advocating forcefully on their behalf. And for me, the biggest thing is keeping their word. And in our experience, our own government, when it commits, will keep its word. I mentioned an example earlier in Murad's case where another government didn't keep its word. That's devastating to families when they feel like not only is this organized crime ring sponsored by another state against them and threatening the life of their family member, but they can't rely on anyone else to be with them in the trench of that fight. That's a terrifying feeling for the families, and it's angering and it's upsetting. And so I think what the government can do, and what I've seen Ambassador Carstens do, is get in the trench with the families and be very straightforward with them. As a deterrent matter, I think, advocating for Murad Tabaz, I would like the government immediately to give everything Iran is asking for so that he can come home.
Yep.
That's not good policy for the government. And so how do we resolve that conflict? One way is to give in exchange for our people what we take from the Iranian state. If the Iranian state is going to do this, those frozen assets, and there are billions of those frozen assets around the globe, need to be taken, held, and exchanged for hostages. When a bully continues to take your friend hostage, you take his milk money and you say, you want the milk money back? Give me the and it's his money you're giving back.
Yeah.
And we have that money at our disposal, but we're using it for other things. So that would be one of my suggestions, is to find a way to use those frozen assets for that purpose.
I want to come back to that momentarily, but I want to go to Carla. In Nazanin's case, there were so many moments where seemingly publicly the British government dropped the ball. And there must have been many more instances of that behind the scenes that we don't know about. not only how frustrating is that, but how do you advise someone that you are representing when they see their government failing them again and again and again?
Well, I think in a way it was hit at before. You only have so many places you can go. You need the UK government. So it was always important to maintain that channel of communication and continue to pressure in all sorts of ways, using different kinds of advocacy, using legal tools, the UK government to do more. Because without the UK government, you're just in a worse position. So you can't really avoid that. I think the most important thing is transparency. The false narratives that developed were really hurtful, harmful, and I think that's a really important lesson for governments, that being clear with these families who are going through the most horrific experiences is just so important. And it's not a big give. So that's got to be a priority.
Jared, you've been dealing with that same issue, continue to deal with it on the Namazi case. Any additional words on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's been a long, hard slog for the Namazis. I mean, CMAC, as you mentioned, was the only American left behind in the January 2016 deal, and was then betrayed again by the U.S. government, which the family had heard from then Secretary of State John Kerry that Foreign Minister Zarif had committed that CMAC would be out in a few weeks. I unfortunately was not representing the family at that time, and it wouldn't have been something I would have taken at face value, because once you unfreeze $100 billion of assets, what leverage do you have left? And I mean, the horror of the family only grew exponentially when literally a month later, instead of CMAC being freed, Bacher Namazi was grabbed when he was returning to Evin prison. I think the U.S. is thankfully ahead of most countries in the world on this by having a central person in charge in the form of Ambassador Carstens, who's been, I think, brilliant in his job. He has constraints obviously imposed by more senior officials at the State Department and the White House, but he and his team are doing the absolute best that they can, and I really do believe that. The reality is, during the Trump administration, we had 11 different interlocutors. Number 11 was Roger. And so having a person in charge in the government is a critical point. I would also point to the Levinson Act and the fact that there are now 11 criteria in the Levinson Act that the State Department must apply in the detention of an American to assess whether or not that American is being detained in a way that is unlawful or wrongful. And if so, that case must be referred to Roger and his office. I'm proud to have been involved in drafting those criteria myself back in 2014-15 to work with Senator Leahy and his brilliant staffer, Tim Reeser, to try to get that moving. And it was fabulous to see it in the Levinson Act itself. Myself and many others are now using those criteria to argue to the State Department on individual cases in ways we couldn't before, that Americans are being unlawfully, wrongfully detained, to try to then compel the Bureau of Consular Affairs to transfer the case to Roger and his office.
One point that I want to make, and then I want to open it up for some questions. We talk about the need for more effective deterrence, and Dave, you talked about this catch-22 of, representing families and wanting to see the U.S. government use all of its assets and resources available to free people. There's two challenges here. And they work on different timelines, but they're equally critical. One is the safe and quick return of Americans being held hostage. And that always has to be the guiding principle, I think, of Roger and everybody else working in this endeavor. But just as importantly is cultivating these deterrent measures long term. And I think for far too long there has been this belief that these are working in conflict with each other. I don't think that that's true, and I think that people working above my pay grade, I hope, within the government and within civil society are spending enough time on this, but unfortunately we haven't seen it come to fruition yet. I want to take a few more questions from the audience.
Jason, on the deterrent piece.
Talk to me.
I think there's a lot to be learned from the way our governments deter other types of criminal conduct. And RICO, the racketeering statute used to bring down organized crime in this country, was so incredibly effective because it targeted individual people who were part of a criminal conspiracy for a certain purpose. And it went after those people, their assets, and hit them where it hurt. And what we have is embedded within a state a criminal conspiracy, much like a RICO conspiracy, of a group of people. And you heard it earlier in the earlier panel. Oh, I had the same interrogator. Oh, I had the same judge. Oh, the same person was negotiating for my release. Guess what? Those same people are involved in every single case. We know the organization they work for. They've been designated a terrorist organization. Now you have all the legal authority you need. You know who they are. And the question is, can we come to that place where we're dealing with them as criminals as opposed to government officials?
Right.
Because government officials, even in Iran, can and should have the privileges and immunities of bona fide government officials. That's how our system works. But when there is a criminal conspiracy within a government, they can't hide behind the facade of government to escape accountability for this kind of crime. And so those people know they should not be traveling to the United States. They should not be traveling to the EU. They should not be attending negotiations and staying at nice hotels. They should not have their homes in Austria or in the south of France. They should not be sending their children to schools in the United States. This is a criminal conspiracy that is torturing, sometimes killing, and detaining for years our citizens without a legal basis. And until I think we are willing to take that very big step of treating this like the criminal conspiracy it is, I think it's very hard to address. And the reason is, as in a RICO conspiracy, if you only go after the organization, in this case the state, the individuals pay no price. There's no consequence. Right. And they benefit from this, both politically and personally. And what we understood with RICO is, no, it's not just the organization. It's the people, it's their resources, it's their livelihoods. And that's a big step to take. It's a slippery slope. We don't want to take apart our international legal system. Can't do that. But this does seem to be a rather peculiar exception to the norm.
Well, and one could just very briefly, and again, a big step to take and would be challenging to achieve. But with the momentum that, so many people here have been working on these cases for years, maybe one could achieve, for example, a new exception in the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act to say that if the State Department has determined under the Levinson Act that a person is unlawfully or wrongfully detained, then that government and the officials involved are not immune from suit in the United States. Again, it would be very hard to achieve that, but I think that is the kind of deterrence that is necessary in order to change behaviors, because Iran, as I was mentioning earlier, profited for years and has been very successful and effective at this hostage enterprise. And so not only has it not been deterred, it's been repeatedly encouraged. And if it's not an American for sale, it's a European for sale.
And an increasingly large number of Europeans. On that topic, with the ongoing detention of Brittany Griner in Russia, do you all have any sense that Moscow has somehow been inspired by Iran's model and is now actively doing this more? And other countries as well. We see it happening in China, Venezuela. Is this Iranian inspired? Is that your sense? Anybody?
Very good question. I do think there are similarities between the Iranian criminal conspiracy and the Russian state's approach to certain issues. We've seen how corrupt the Russian state can be, and we've seen their increasing use of unlawful detention and intimidation and even assassination to accomplish their political objectives. So I don't put really anything past the Russian state. They're not playing by the same rules. Not sure I'm qualified to comment on any particular case, but I do think it's important to distinguish between cases that there isn't even a plausible reason for the detention other than pure hostage taking, pure leverage, and those cases where states have some legitimate criminal interest. And again, I don't know. I know my cases. I don't know those other cases well enough to comment. But I do think if Americans are being held hostage in Russia, then they should be treated with the same strategies that we treat hostages in Iran.
I would note, though, it's important because my own work goes well beyond that of American hostages. That dictators around the world regularly take hostages of their own nationality that are political threats to them. And so, for example, I'm representing two of the presidential candidates in Nicaragua, Felix Mardiaga and Juan Sebastian Chamorro, who each have 13-year prison sentences, in essence, for conspiring to overthrow the democracy.
Running for president.
Right, and exactly. And it's been reported publicly that, Daniel Ortega's son has approached the State Department to offer a trade to release the hostages in exchange for a relaxation or dropping of all U.S. sanctions, right? Which isn't going to happen because most of those sanctions don't relate to hostage taking as well. But it doesn't just actually happen in the hostage enterprise when it comes to Americans or foreigners detained in Iran. It happens with dictators around the world. And so I think in that sense, it's been well known for quite some time that, the imprisonment of high-profile political prisoners or hostages can have benefits to governments. And the challenge is, how do we navigate the need to help support and free prisoners in these circumstances without encouraging the hostage enterprise? And it's a very, very tough trade-off. I mean, like Dave, I hope the U.S. government does literally everything it needs to do to bring home the Nazis, but I understand practically that won't mean anything. It will have to be ultimately some kind of deal struck that the United States can live with.
Carla, I have a question specifically for you. An audience member says that you argued in an academic paper that hostage taking should be considered, or could be considered, a crime against humanity. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. Crime against humanity doesn't need to happen in the context of an armed conflict. So we're not looking at that. Basically, we're looking at a crime which is widespread or systematic. Systematic, we can clearly see with respect to the involvements of a range of facets of the Iranian government. It's targeted at a clear civilian population, that being foreign nationals, dual nationals, and others. And with respect to the range of different crimes that crimes against humanity involves, detention, torture are included. So I think we have a clear basis that in certain circumstances where we can say that it's widespread or systematic, that the act of hostage taking can amount to crimes against humanity. The reason why that's important is that it brings into play a whole further area of law, which can be helpful with respect to accountability, given the range of states which have particular legislation outlawing and with an obligation to prosecute crimes against humanity. As well as the impact it could have with respect to different UN organs.
Thank you for that. I have time for one more question, and it's an important one. Too often these cases are seen by some people as the natural result of policy choices made by the US, the UK, or other countries. This is the natural result of doing X or doing Y. And is that true? I mean, is there a foregone conclusion that a country like Iran is going to take hostages because of something that the U.S. government did? How do we combat that kind of thinking if we disagree with it?
I don't think that's right, and I never want to blame the victim, and I do think that the governments of the U.S. and the U.K. And the families and the hostages obviously are all victims in this crime. So I wouldn't go that far. I do think that the repetition of this behavior by the Iranian government shows that our governments have not yet figured out how best to deter this behavior. It shows how tricky this problem is. And I don't envy those in government that need to figure this out. I do think that fundamentally it's a question of increasing the costs of this behavior so that they exceed the benefits. And there are lots of different ways you could do that, but fundamentally that is the trick, is making it so that it's no longer in the interests of these countries, Iran chief among them, to have this as a state policy and to sponsor this kind of terrorism and criminal hostage taking. I do think one of the ways to do that is to make it hurt financially for these states. I don't think it makes sense for us to be releasing or unfreezing large tranches of state assets when we in this country have, and I'm sure it's true in the UK, large outstanding judgments of courts yet to be paid. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me, that a country can continue to do this and get its money back from us before being penalized for this behavior.
I have time for one more question. It's an important one. There's been a lot of talk recently about a proposed treaty between Iran and Belgium that would pave the way for prisoners doing time in those two countries be returned to presumably do that time in their home country. Some have deemed this as sort of opening the door to a possible prisoner exchange that might include a convicted terrorist. I'm not going to opine on what the Belgian and Iranian governments have in mind here, but I'd like you all to opine on it. Jared, what do you think?
Well, I mean, obviously it's deeply problematic. I think it should be self-evident from what we've learned about this potential deal. Look, I think the bottom line is, for example, the United States wouldn't accept a prisoner transfer from abroad and to then have that person serve time in the United States if there were not objective reasons to believe the person was actually guilty of the so-called crimes that they were accused and convicted of. And so in the U.S. context, I can't ever see something like that ever actually working. But more importantly, it just incentivizes more hostage taking. And while I do want the U.S. to do whatever is necessary to bring my clients home, and we do have to clear the decks with Iran so that we can start from scratch where we're not having to cut another deal with Iran. My view is that we need to bring home the American hostages and do whatever is necessary to do that, and then put in place draconian, bilateral or multilateral disincentives to stop this behavior from happening in the future, and then be prepared to drop the hammer, if and when that happens next. Of course, in Iran there are countless Americans and other foreign nationals who aren't yet imprisoned, but are simply the subject of travel bans. Right. And so there is a large swath of people that the government of Iran is already looking to detain at the right time, to keep the revolving door going. But I think that we have to, work creatively as possible, although there are certain lines like that kind of a treaty that to me are a bridge too far.
Carla, I want to give the last word to you. You're over in that direction across the pond from us. What does it look like from there, and what sort of precedent could that set in Europe for future deals with Iran by other countries?
I think it's really problematic. I would go even further to say that what's to lead it from making a country like Belgium or any other country that might think about putting this in place, it's going to stop them from arresting any Iranian national for anything. Let's say there's a mass murderer, let's say any kind of crime. it's gonna make them think twice about arresting. So it's horrible for the rule of law. Also, it has this glean of kind of whitewashing the Iranian legal system, because usually when you have these kinds of agreements, it's all about parity. So Belgium is saying something positive about the Iranian legal system and vice versa. So it's a farce, I would suggest.
I'm going to have to end it there. I really, really appreciate all of your insights, everybody for joining us today, for Ambassador Carson's remarks, and for his presence. Have a wonderful afternoon, and please continue to pay attention to these hostage cases that are ongoing, and raise the awareness in your communities as much as you can. Thank you so much.